Well, members of the European Parliament have overwhelmingly adopted red lines for negotiations over a Brexit deal. The guidelines were approved by 516 votes for and 133 against, with 50 abstentions. Under the agreement, the British government should first agree to divorce terms before striking a new trade deal with the bloc. It also calls for protecting the rights of EU citizens in Britain and the border in Northern Ireland. The EU Parliament was the first institution to take an official stance on Brexit talks a week after the British Prime Minister officially triggered Article 50 to start the country's withdrawal process from the EU in 2 years. The guidelines for negotiations will be formally approved at an EU summit in late April. To discuss that further, we're now joined by Chris Dorsey, who is an economic and political commentator who's joining us live now via Skype from Brisbane. So, Dorsey, thanks for joining us. What do you make of this move by the EU?
Well, I think it's, as usual, for public consumption. It's political theater, because at the end of the day, all the EU nations and all the nations of the world are controlled by their monetary source, which is the Bank for International Settlements. And unfortunately, the Bank for International Settlements, which controls the Bank of Russia, the Bank of China, the ECB, the Federal Reserve Bank, etc., all of the central banks of the world, with the of Iran at this point, and possibly North Korea, they are controlled by an international organized crime network that controls all the governments of the world. And this is just political theater, as we see Jared Kushner and the President of the United States, who is the father-in-law of Jared Kushner, is working deals with Anbang Insurance and the People's Bank of China, the #1 client of Donald Trump's New York Trump Tower is the People's Bank of China. And of course, we all know about the Russian connections to the organized crime network that controls not only Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, but Donald Trump and the White House in the United States. So we know it's a Jewish organized crime network that, through control of all of the legislative bodies of the world and through control of all of the central banks and all of the deadly weapons of war, subjugate all the citizens of the world. And it doesn't matter whether it's some sort of one country leaving a larger bloc in Europe, because all of those government bodies are controlled by their monetary source. And in this case, it's the Bank for International Settlements, which through Basel III sets all the capitalization rates for all the central banks of the world. And then there is, of course, no coincidence when we're talking about public theater that on 3/22, just like the 3/22 staged terrorist attacks by the Mossad and the CIA and the FSB, there were staged terrorist attacks on 3/22 in London, right before the Brexit ceremonial distractions. So that's what we're dealing with here in the world. All the governments of the world are controlled by one organized crime network, which at this point seems to be fronted by the Russian Jewish organized crime family, the Russian mob, as it's euphemistically termed, even though it's a Jewish mob that controls all the governments of the world. And we can say names like Felix Sater and Tevfik Arif, and they're operators in Moscow and Washington, D.C., reaching the highest levels of our government, including Donald Trump. And then we can talk about Jeffrey Epstein, who compromises all of these international politicians through his child rape network and, of course, his partner, Ghislaine Maxwell. And we know that they met, Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein met Virginia Roberts, who was to be a underage sex slave to Prince Andrew. So then we tie it back to Brexit, where all of these politicians and even the royal families are compromised, blackmail material.
Okay, Mr. Dorsey, we'll leave it there at that, but of course, we do appreciate you taking your time out to speak to us here at Press TV.